Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm really honored to make or to share my opinions with you, especially after such a brilliant lecture about Afghanistan and the issue that is even, I think, much more important than what I'm going to talk about now. When we are talking and thinking about the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the modern society, not only in Poland but also worldwide, I think that we have to uh, make, and that's my initial assumption, make a broader view or take a broader view of what was happening before. Because I like to use a sentence or a phrase to describe how will the world look like after the pandemic, is that the world will look like almost the same as before, but even more. So in order to understand how will the world look like after the pandemic, we still are within the pandemic, but how will the world look like after the pandemic? We need to understand how did it look like before the COVID-19 pandemic. And therefore, I would like to move back to the early 90s and the emergence of the New World Order after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Cold War. And what is important is that since the 70s and the 80s, we were observing the process of rising globalization, economic and political globalization, and the third wave of democracy described by Samuel Huntington. And as a matter of fact, we were witnesses of the triumph of the liberal individualism and the triumph of the negative understanding of liberty, that we are free to do something, and we cannot be affected by something that we do not like. And the diminishing role of the positive liberty, that is the freedom to do something, or freedom to share, or to give something from us. And as a result, we also were witnesses of the dismantle of the welfare state since the beginning of the 90s, especially in the European Union, or in Europe, because it looks completely different in United States. But still, even if you look at what was going on in US, we have the Reaganomics in the 80s and the decline of the welfare state idea in the Western world. And as a result, we were observing the privatization of public and social responsibility. And concurrently, we have observed the massification of especially higher education and the concept of meritocracy, so that every single person has tools to take care of their own. So there is the concept of self-sufficiency that in the debate, like that is coming from the Marx philosophy, that there is the agency versus structure. We believe that the agency is even more important, that everything is dependent on us, and we have keys to our success in our hands. But the result of such thinking or such paradigm was the rise of social economic inequalities within the last 3 decades. And the second result that is maybe not very often seen by the experts and by the academics is the global decline of total fertility rate. And as a result, the change of the age structure of the society. So we in the Western world are witnesses of the aging societies and the rising discrepancies between the older generation, especially the boomers, so the generations born after the Second World War, then the millennials and the new generation, the so-called Generation Z, that was born somehow in the late 90s and in the 21st century. Now I would like to move to the process of the shift from the old to the new world order. And actually, it started with the financial crisis of 2008 and the Occupy Wall Street in US or Indignados movement in Spain. And we have observed that people, especially the younger generation, lost their confidence in the meritocracy. They lost the confidence in the agency. They understood that the structure is very often much more important, so that they are not independent. So they are dependent on many different factors that are out of their control. And as a matter of fact, we entered the second decade of the 21st century, the decade of many crises. We started with the global financial crisis, but then we had the Greek crisis, the migrant crisis, and dozens of crises in the second decade of the 21st century. The decade of crises actually finished with the last, but the biggest one, which was the COVID-19 pandemic. And the result of all those crises was the rise of global fear. Actually, the process of the great comeback of fear to our social life starts in 9/11, 2001, because then we let the governments to control us in order to assure us security. So the concept and the feeling of fear became present in the social life. But actually, the COVID-19 brought it to the fundamental level of the life of every single human being. So even if you don't commute with the plane, even if you live in a place that is not reached by the terrorist attack, you can be afraid of something. That is now the COVID-19. And I would like to put that in a line with the second very important challenge that is especially important for the younger generation, which is the climate change. In the recent years, we observed Greta Thunberg, the Swedish activist that calls the younger generation to protest or to make a strike against the climate change. So we have now the school strikes for climate, which is already globally widespread. So what we can observe in the recent years is the rise of the Generation Z, and so as the generation who was not believing in the agency, they believed much more in structure, that they are dependent, and that they should be responsible not only for themselves but also for the other members of the society. But concurrently, some members of this generation, they become doomers. So the people that don't believe that we can manage or we can deal with the climate crisis and that the world is coming to its end. So there was a rising between the generations. So the millennials and the boomers, they're still believing in the self-sufficiency. They were believing in meritocracy. They were believing in agency. And the rising Generation Z that actually led behind those beliefs, and they were tending much more into the concept of common responsibility, and concurrently the historical pessimism. And the fear that was introduced by the COVID-19 actually proved for many of them that the world is coming to its end. And the COVID-19 actually brought a lot of paradoxes for us, because we might thought that there will be a rising tension between the generations. But concurrently, especially in Poland, I don't have the deep insight into another society. But what I can see in Poland is that the youth that were very afraid of the climate change 2 3 years ago now are much more afraid of the lockdown. They are much more afraid of losing their youth. They are much more afraid of unemployment. We have the boomers who were the people that were believing in some individual, so in the agency, and finally they understood that they are not able to cope with the problems alone, so that they need society, they need lockdown in order to protect their health. So we have the switch. So the boomers and to some extent the millennials, they switch their attitude from the individualistic approach into the solidar approach or solidaristic approach. And on the other hand, we have the Gen Z and the Doomers that now are looking much more into some individualistic answers, that they have to take care of their own interest, rather to look on some solidary or solidaristic answers to the current issues. And what is really interesting is that even in the social service, we can see that the boomers are much more interested now in the climate issues than the representatives of the younger generation. So that is the very paradoxical switch that COVID-19 brought us to the Polish society. And we have to be aware that the COVID-19 actually distributed costs and economic and social costs between different groups in a different way. So there is they are not only the differences in distribution of costs between the societies, but also within society. So we know that most of the states decided to introduce the non-pharmaceutical interventions, to introduce lockdowns, and to give support, especially for the older members of the society. But the victims of the crisis were very often the younger people that were not very much affected by the COVID-19 risk. But on the other hand, they were affected by the unemployment, by the lockdown. Many of them were working in the service sector that was completely closed during the pandemic. Probably because we saw some signs of solidarity between people during the pandemic. But my fear, or I'm afraid that is that after the pandemic, we'll rather see the rising individualism rather than solidarity. The younger generation, who was the proponent of the solidaristic approach, now is standing much more into the individualistic solutions, and we can be witness of the great divorce between people, between countries, and between the generations. And even if it was quite difficult to find some common understanding between the generations before the COVID-19, now it might become even more difficult to find the common understanding for the older and younger generation, and to find some social cohesion that is really important for the post-COVID era. Thank you.